I'd like to review and elaborate on a couple of points that Professor Gendler made in the YouTube that you were watching, her YouTube lecture. She made this distinction between descriptive and normative, she said, components of philosophy. I mean, think of a component of philosophy, sounds a little strange, but it's a kind of study. But there is a distinction, and she makes that she's making. It's a very good one between, let's say, a descriptive kind of study, which is a philosophical study, and a normative study. And when we think about it, descriptive ought to tell you it's something that deals with describing or explaining how things are, the way things are. So that would make something a descriptive study. And let's think about what kind of questions would be answered with this, or philosophical questions would be answered with a descriptive study. Now, she also was talking about normative. She didn't use this word, but I'll use the word prescriptive study. And let's focus on prescriptive because I think it'll better help you understand what normative is. Because when we're thinking about prescriptive study, what word do you see there? Obviously, prescription. What is a prescription, guys? Where do you get a prescription? Get it at the drugstore, right? Why is it called a prescription? Think about that for a second. The idea is you're buying whatever medication you're getting. If you just buy it, have you done everything you need to? No, rather, it's giving you a set of instructions that ought to be followed in order for you to get well. I mean, the same way you get a prescription for physical therapy if you've injured, sometimes after a broken bone and your muscles have atrophied, or if you have a soft tissue injury, they send you to a physical therapist, but the physical therapist, the orthopedist, sends a prescription, a script of what the orthopedist is supposed to work on. So a prescription is a set of instructions, that should be followed. Are they always followed? Is that the way things are? No, quite often people are given medications and they don't take it. It doesn't help their conditions and they get worse. Now, she uses the term normative, and I think it's getting at the same kind of idea. If you think about it, it has the word normal in it. And when you're describing something as being normal, you're saying that it meets a certain standard, that there's a certain standard way things are. And when we think about normative, we're thinking about norms. And the idea is not what the standards in fact are, but rather what the standards what the standards should be. So a normative study is a study about what standards ought to be. It deals with explaining how things ought to be. And this should be reminiscent of the discussion we had earlier about when Professor Sandel said he had two questions. He had one question, sorry, that he was asking, and I said there were really two questions because one was what would you do, and the other one's what ought you do. And we talked about the is-ought distinction that David Hume had made. We talked a little bit about David Hume just to refresh your memory. Okay, now let's turn to applying these concepts, how she applies these concepts to the general questions of philosophy. Okay, and I had I had said this, and I will say it again. That is, I would say the philosophical studies, all studies in philosophy, answer questions that fall in really three topic areas. What are the topic areas? Reality, and the branch of philosophy that studies reality, she told you, is metaphysics. She talked about the kind of questions, but we'll come back and talk about that in more detail. Knowledge, and the branch of philosophy that studies questions about knowledge, philosophical questions about knowledge, is epistemology, theory of knowledge, and we'll talk about what a few of those questions are. And questions of value, which you spent a lot of time with Professor Gendler on. And in the area of value, one set of questions are about aesthetics, and that's a question about beauty. Is there an objective standard? We'll talk a little bit. And she very fairly extensively talked to you about ethics, which is sometimes called moral philosophy. What kind of problems, it's how ought you behave, what's the right thing to do. And then there was a sub branch, or at least I put it as a political philosophy, which I had you look at, which is really where one, or I shouldn't say where, one area in which philosophy really has a practical application.